Welcome to a night of bone-chilling tales that will make you rethink your everyday life. From harmless pranks that turn into nightmares, to haunted houses hiding sinister secrets, and mysterious strangers lurking in the shadows, these are stories that you won't soon forget. Stay with us, if you dare, because the scariest moments are yet to come. When my troublemaking friends and I were 13 years old, one of the many rowdy and mischievous things we would do was Saturday night ding-dong ditch sessions. 10 years ago, we all lived on the same block in a typical suburban neighborhood. At the time, there were fewer houses and more woods. I'm going to make up names for my friends for the sake of this story. Mark, James, and Matt. Either Mark or James were usually the ones to go up to the houses and ring the bells. Matt and I, on the other hand, would usually find hiding spots right away. We hit about 5 or 6 houses. I remember all the men who answered the doors gave pretty much the same reactions. They would step out onto the stoop. 1 or 2 would yell something, and then they'd walk back inside. For a couple of houses, we rang the bell again for a better reaction. One guy yelled he was calling the cops the second time, so when he shut his door, we all booked it down the street and went to the next block over. As I mentioned, 10 years ago in this neighborhood, there were patches of woods sitting where houses stand today. On the next block over, there were a few patches of woods surrounding some of the houses, and the houses on this block seemed more unkempt. The first house on the block was across the street from a patch of woods, which made for a perfect hiding spot. The house was kind of rundown looking. Tall grass, a ratty old car with a cover on it in the driveway, and overall just a small house. Mark went up to ring the bell. He barely had time to make it across the street before the door opened. It was another man who answered the door. This guy, really big, about 6 foot with a stocky build. Unlike the others, he was furious immediately. He walked around his whole front yard, checking the bushes, yelling threats. We all laughed as we always did. Eventually, he finally went back inside. Mark waited a few minutes, checked the windows, and then ran back up the stoop to ring the bell again. I didn't envy him with this house. I would not be bold enough to ring that man's bell again. Mark knew he probably didn't have as much time, so he ran to the side of the house and out of sight. The door opened much quicker this time, and this time, the man came out with a rifle in his hand. We all looked at each other simultaneously, going, "Oh no." The man checked all the places he checked before, and then a few extra places this time, like behind his car and behind a couple of trees. Then he walked to the center of his lawn and just stood there as if he were thinking. He looked around, and then his head stopped as he faced us in the woods. Matt, James, and I looked at each other and ducked lower, hoping he didn't see us. After 10 seconds of staring in our direction, the man went back into his home. We then saw him appear at his front window, standing still like a statue, looking in our direction in the woods once again. He saw Mark creeping back over to the man's front door, but there was nothing we could do. We were too afraid to move or yell anything. Mark rang the bell once again and ran for it. The man didn't move though, at least not for another minute. Then he turned and walked away from the window. We didn't see Mark again, but we were still too nervous to move or say anything. The next thing I remember, we heard Mark's voice from across the street yelling, "Run!" We didn't understand until we heard someone running up from behind us, realizing upon turning our heads that it was the man from across the street with his rifle in hand, pointed at us. We ran like little prey from a predator to Mark, who was waiting for us across the street. We ran for blocks until we were sure we lost him. Mark explained that he yelled when he saw the man sneaking across the street into the patch of woods with his gun. We didn't report him or any of what happened. We just told a few friends, and that was it. Luckily, the house was many blocks from us, so we never really had to pass it again. I lived in a house from hell for a couple of weeks. I was a college student, And my parents were paying for a house for me to live in. Spoiled, I know. Well, the house was modest, nothing fancy or huge, and I was happy with it. Well, for the first few days anyway. Then things quickly started getting strange. On a rainy Saturday with nothing to do, I was watching TV for a few hours. That was when I heard a scrape on my living room floor. I looked around the room, thinking an animal got into the house or something. I sat back down and resumed watching TV. That was the first weird occurrence. The rain continued throughout the rest of the day and into the night, which made for an excuse to not go out. I stayed in, watching more TV in the living room. I perked up when I thought I heard something from the kitchen. Laughably, I took a pillow with me as some sort of weapon and walked over to the kitchen doorway. There, in the middle of the dark kitchen, was a box of Cheerios on the floor, spilling out hundreds of the tiny O's. I had no idea how that could have happened. Nevertheless, I dropped the pillow and began cleaning up the Cheerios off the floor. As I was doing so, I heard a creak, like the sound weak areas of a wood floor make when someone steps on them. It was by the kitchen table. I looked up, but nobody was there. I knew I was going crazy now. Every little sound must have been making me paranoid. I cleaned the Cheerios and went back to watching TV. The thunder outside was getting louder as the bulk of the storm seemed to be passing overhead. Yet I found it to be strangely relaxing. That was the last thing I remember appreciating. The sound of the storm outside, before waking up from what seemed to be an hour-long doze. The TV was still on, but that wasn't what woke me. I remember believing I woke up to a bang or a thud from downstairs. Regardless, I turned off the TV and marched upstairs to bed. The next day was normal, as was the day after that. It wasn't until the next gray, rainy day that strange things started happening again. I woke up in my bed that morning, feeling like I had been drinking all night the night before. I felt sicker than I'd ever felt with any hangover before. I didn't do much walking around that day. The gloomy, dark weather only made me more bedridden. I left the TV in my bedroom on all day, just as background noise, with a garbage pail by my side in case I had to puke. At midday, I muted the TV after hearing sounds coming from above me. The attic. The attic door was actually in my bedroom, and most of the attic was built over that bedroom. It wasn't just one thud I heard. It was 3 or 4. I managed to get out of bed, despite the fact that every time I moved, I wanted to puke. I pulled the string to the attic door down, took one of my old baseball bats with me, and climbed up the steps. I pulled the light switch down to light up the attic. There were a few old boxes that must have belonged to the previous owner scattered about, but I couldn't see any living things that could have produced those noises. I climbed back down quickly because I was kind of scared of that attic. There were no more noises until that night. I woke up to what I first thought was thunder. Still feeling a bit sick, the familiar sound of a thud from up in the attic gave me chills. I pulled the string to the attic door back down, took my baseball bat once again, and climbed up the stairs. I made myself angry and screamed in the most intimidating voice I could, but before I could turn the light on, I heard the sound of a child giggling in the pitch-black attic. Words cannot describe the feeling of weightlessness, the feeling of my insides dropping inside of my body, the fear that I felt. The word fear is not enough to describe what I felt at that moment. I was out of that house so fast I don't even remember running. I called my dad in the cold rain and asked him to pick me up. I explained everything the best I could. My parents saw how emotional I was about this, and in a weird sense, I think they believed me. I packed all of my things up with my parents the next day and moved back home. To this day, I'm convinced what I experienced in that house was completely paranormal. I used to work as a maid for some old lady for a couple of weeks when I was 20. She had a really big yet old house on a property that could have been beautiful if she had actually taken care of it. She had 2 acres of land surrounded by woods in 3 directions, and the road on the other. The house itself was ancient, mostly made of wood, and the interior was really, really dark. She would often keep the blinds shut in some rooms for reasons I didn't understand. I would sometimes open the blinds to let some sunlight in, only to find that she'd have closed them again the next day. Working there wasn't really hard. She didn't really make me do a lot. I would just do the basics like vacuuming, sweeping, doing the laundry, and so on. However, I would sometimes be left with big projects, like once she told me to clean out the basement of all her dead husband's old tools and boxes of God knows what. When I opened the basement door to flick the light switch on, it didn't work, but I could see light seeping up from the floor of the basement. That meant at least one light was working. The old lady hadn't given me any flashlight, so I figured I'd find one in the basement itself. I started my descent down the stairs into the basement, which was way longer than I expected it to be. I didn't realize the basement was going to be as big as the entire first floor of the house. It was so dark down there, and when I reached the bottom, the only light that actually worked was on the far side of the basement. It was a huge basement with lots of old furniture and random junk. I started my search for a flashlight, which I eventually found. However, I didn't find it on one of the shelves, no. I found it in the hand of an old man who I had never seen before, sitting in an old rocking chair. When he handed me the flashlight, I thought it was a little odd, but I figured it was a neighbor or a friend of the old lady's, so I didn't question it and just thanked him for the flashlight. Then I went back upstairs. That same day, the old lady came to see how I was doing and saw the flashlight in my hand. I told her that a kind old man sitting in the rocking chair had given it to me. She looked at the flashlight and then at me with what I can only describe as a blank stare, as if she didn't know what to say. She took the flashlight from me and said I could be done with the basement for today, so I obeyed. Later that night, I was cleaning the floor of the kitchen when the old lady came into the room and asked me about the man I saw earlier in the basement. I simply repeated that I saw an old man sitting in the rocking chair. She asked me to describe him, so I did. Her reaction was something I can't quite describe. It was more so just a blank stare and silence, which seemed to last forever. Eventually, she came to and told me that I could leave for the night, so I did. The next day, I came back to the house to find the front door unlocked, which was strange. The old lady had always been there to answer the door, as she had been all the previous times I worked there. When I couldn't find her, I started calling her name throughout the house. I started upstairs and made my way to the main floor and then the basement. The flashlight was missing from the shelf, which worried me. I searched the entire basement, using my phone flashlight this time, but she was nowhere to be found. Eventually, I stopped my search and decided to call the police. I was questioned, and I had to be truthful about the man in the basement. The police did their searching but found nothing. The lady just disappeared, and so did the man I saw down there. I quit that job immediately, and to this day, the house remains vacant. It was abandoned for 3 years now, and I feel it's only a matter of time before the house is torn down.